Welcome to this video tutorial. We're going to take a look at the new blur gallery feature in Photoshop CS6. We're using Photoshop CS6 Beta here. So let's jump right in. We're going to take a look first at the TiltShift blur. There's three blurs in the blur gallery right here: field, iris, and TiltShift blur. Now we're going to start with TiltShift because I kind of think that's one most people are going to immediately jump in and want to play with. So let's take a look. Go ahead and hit TiltShift, and you're going to see the first thing that happens is this strange UFO is dropped into the center of your image. And there are these lines going everywhere. Well, basically this thing we're going to call it a pin, and what you can do with this is you can drag your blur around. All right, we're gonna move it in a second, but we want to kind of play with the settings of this tilt shift blur first. Well, before we do much, we can adjust the actual level of blur using the blur slider over here in the tilt shift blur tools panel. It's right over here. But you can also move your mouse between the inner dot and the outer circle and just kind of drag around that circle, and that little white line that's filling up, that indicates, hey, you've got a ton of blur or not so much blur. Alright, so we'll increase the blur a little bit. I tend to find that I use the slider over here in the panel more often. It's just easier for me to reach over and control it. This can be a little hit or miss, but it can be fun too. The two solid lines, they indicate the area of the image that's going to be tack sharp, so within there, sharp. You can drag these lines down and up to kind of make the sharpened area a little bit less. So more of the image is going to be blurry, less is going to be sharp. So kind of pull them in on themselves. The word is escaping me right now. But then you also have these dashed lines here, and you can drag them up or down to sort of increase the amount of fade. So we're going to fade from completely blurred to completely sharp over the course of this little area between solid and dashed line. So you can see, you can drag these lines independent of one another. All right, we're going to sort of push this guy up down here to compress that blur in between those two lines. That's the word I was searching for, compress. However, what we want to do, because I happen to know there's a little car parked over here, and I want that to be sharp and the rest of this little island to just kind of fade away, just drop off into the rest of the image, into the blurry abyss. In order to follow the contour of this image, these lines, we need to rotate this tilt shift blur, and you can do that by hovering over this little white dot and just dragging to either the right or the left. I'm going to drag it to the left, and there we go. That looks like it's good enough for me. And I'm going to pull this dot down, and there are my two little vehicles. Cool. And what we want to do now is drag the blur for the top section of our tilt shift blur over to here. So allow the space in this image to sort of give this blur room to breathe, if you will. Just fading off almost as if it was natural, right off to the other side of the island, just like that. And then you go ahead and hit OK. Give Photoshop a second to think. It's going to think. It's going to think. There we go. The progress bar. And boom. There we go. We have this cool tilt shift effect to where we go from an image that looks like, hey, yeah, you took it out of an airplane, which is cool. But then you add this tilt shift effect, and it almost looks like you can reach into the scene and adjust the little car or move this tree or do all kinds of neat little things. Really, really a cool effect. And I'm sure you've seen these images on the web before where people have taken shots from the top of buildings down onto streets, and there's so much coolness that you can do with tilt shift lenses and this tilt shift effect in Photoshop. Alright, we're going to close this, and we're going to hop on over to this document, and we're going to take a look at the field blur. Now, the field blur is a very simple blur that's going to allow you to, blur your document like you would expect to be able to blur it, but with some kind of added features, some interesting things. So what I want to do is I want to keep the foreground here, maybe just a patch of road in front of me, sharp, while the rest of the scene gets fairly blurry. So let's do that. We're going to go Filter, Blur, Field Blur. And again, default Photoshop drops a pin into the center of your document here. And I'm going to drag this guy, I'm going to drag him up to here. But notice that the entire document is blurry. What's going on? We have no control. Well, we do have some control. We can make it more blurry or less blurry. That's not the kind of control I'm talking about. What we can do is we can take our points and we can add an additional point. So let's say I want down here to be in focus. I can drop a point in down here. Still blurry, don't worry. We can reduce the blur to 0 and get sharpness. So that's pretty neat. Well, we can select this point here, and let's increase this blur a bit, maybe up to 25 or 30, and you can see we're really blurring this street scene very, very much. That's neat, and what's happening is automatically between these 2 points, Photoshop is saying, alright, so we've got a 30 pixel blur here and 0 here. Fade them together. Then if we add another point over here, right, and we're going to increase the blur over here to like 35 as well, 35, 40, something like that. Now Photoshop is saying, all right, we've got 35 pixels here, fade that to the 30 pixel blur, and also fade it to the 0 pixel blur down here. And you can add a whole ton of points, so it's really neat. There's all kinds of cool things you can do with the field blur, adding and removing points, which brings me to this. You can remove points. Let's say you add a point here. Whoop, didn't want that point there. You can get rid of it by just, well, make sure you've got it selected and hit the delete key. It's gone. I don't want this point here. Select it, delete key, gone. I do want that point there, however, so it actually looks kind of cool without it, though. We're going to drop it in for the sake of what I'm about to show you, and we're going to increase the blur back up to about 30, 25, 30, something like that. And I'm going to add another point down here, and I'm going to set it to 0. Increase the area down here that is kind of sharp and in focus. One of the other cool things I should show you here before I move on to the next thing is you can drop pins outside of your document. So I could drop a pin over here. Let's say I just want a little bit of blur in the corner, just like that. And it's sort of just, if you imagine the blur emanating from this pin and just spilling all over, we're just getting that one little bit that shows up there. And then we can even adjust this. Not quite as much blur. There we go, just like that. And you can move this pin around, drop it wherever you like. There we go, cool. So a little bit of blur thrown there in the corner just because we can. Now, one of the neat things about field blur and all of these blur filter or blur gallery tools is that you can introduce bokeh. You can see that it's really just blurring these street lights out. Well, we can come over here to blur effects and we can apply some bokeh. Now, it's a little hit or miss, and you're not really going to add bokeh where bokeh normally wouldn't have been if you hadn't taken a photograph with a very wide open aperture, for instance. But I'm not going to get into the photographic jargon side of things. Just know that the bokeh it's a little hit or miss. Sometimes it'll be really, really cool. Sometimes it's not so cool and it looks pretty bad. So let's just see what we can get. We'll play with these settings a little bit. So the first thing you've got is light bokeh. And I'm going to increase it a bit. And you can see I've just got these fireballs, not looking very good at all. However, I'm going to also have a little bit of faith here. And I'm going to jack this guy up to about 60. You can see we've got some street lights lighting up. A little bit of a bokeh-ish effect happening, which is kind of neat. We can introduce color. The problem I've found with the color is I think it's supposed to inherit colors right out of the photograph, which it does a decent job of doing. But sometimes you'll have, you know, like there's a little bit of blue over here, and sometimes you'll just have like an odd big line of blue, or just too much of one color, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So, you know, there should be a little bit of green and orange, but not too much. This should primarily be like the yellows and reds, I guess a little bit of orange, but not much blue, not much green. And if I go cranking this way up, that starts to happen. Well, still looks pretty bad, so we still have this light range slider. Now, the light range slider just takes a little bit of playing around with. We're going to compress it a little bit and see what we get. So drag the black handle toward the white. That actually looks kind of neat. We are still getting some defined circles up there, which is cool. See what happens if we drag it the other way. It looks pretty bad. You can see it sort of starts to look like an explosion of terribleness happening. However, let's just go ahead and reduce the actual level of bokeh and see what happens. Bring it up to about something like there. That actually looks kind of neat. You got this little check box here. You can tick that off. That's what it looked like without the bokeh. And tick it on. That's what it looks like with it. So it's pretty cool. But check this out too. Before we move off of this, if you increase the blur a lot, it's going to behave as if you had, well, if it goes ahead and increases. Let's go ahead and increase the blur of our top two pins. What am I thinking? I had the corner pin selected, so you can see we've got a nice 100 pixel blur down there. Great. Let's blur out the top pins here, like so. And you can see, give it a second, that this bokeh is really starting to take some crazy shape and do some stuff up there, which is kind of neat. I kind of like it. Give it a second, as it needs to re-render. This will take some time. So you can see it's kind of a cool little effect. There's, well, give it a minute, here it comes. But you can see just like this crazy cool arc it's placing in the road. So this is without the bokeh. You tick it on, and again, Photoshop's got to re-render it once again. And you're going to have kind of a neat effect. And again, you can then go and play with light range and the light bokeh and the color and everything like that to get an effect close to what you're looking for. So it does an admirable job. It's kind of a neat feature, and it's a lot of fun to play with. So that's that. I'll go ahead and commit the change, and we'll give Photoshop a minute to just sort of sort its stuff out and go through the progress bar. And you can see just like that, it's committed the changes. Looks great. We're going to, well, maybe not looks great, but looks interesting. We're going to close that, Nah, I don't need to save it. Now we're going to take a look at the iris blur. So we're going to go blur iris blur. So you had the field blur, which was sort of blurring everything. Well, the iris blur is sort of like blur everything, but protect this area here within the oval, but fade it all together. So at the center of this point is absolute sharpness, fading out to absolute blurriness, and obviously you control the level of blurriness out there, all right, using your blur slider over here in the Blur Tools options. Now, there are a lot of really neat things you can do with the iris blur tool, so let's take a look at them. Again, you can just do all the normal stuff. You can drag your pins, you can add or reduce the blur by filling that little ring. But you can also then control sort of where the sharpness stops, and that's what these white circular dots are. So I'm going to pull these in because we want her eye to be, bam, sharp in focus, and immediately upon exiting her eye, it's going to start fading out. However, this is a little bit too much, so I'm going to grab, you can grab your either the top and bottom anchor handles or the left and right anchor handles. I'm going to start with left and right. I'm going to pinch it in a little bit, and you can see here what I've got going on. It's also pinching the dots within it. Don't worry, we're going to play with that in a second. And I'm going to pull this guy down a little bit. Now, you can see you can rotate this as well by just hovering over any one of these anchor points and just rotating. I want to rotate. And you can also, if you grab this large square, you can sort of create this rounded rectangle, which is a little bit of kind of like a squared blur, which is kind of interesting. I think we're going to stick with kind of an ovalish blur. Now, if you are following along, or if you were watching a moment ago, when I pulled away with these dots that control the sharp area, when I grab one, all four of them move. I don't necessarily want that. While I do want her eye to be entirely in focus, I want these guys on the top and bottom to be a little bit closer. You can adjust one of these points at a time by just holding down your Alt or Option key. Go ahead and just drag that guy closer. Look at that. That's awesome. Drag this guy a little bit closer. Sweet. So just like that, we've created this blur where her eye is going to be sharp and the rest of her face is falling out of focus. Now, we're not limited to just one point here with our iris blur. I'm going to also bring her lips back into focus. So I'm going to drop this point right down there. Kind of neat. And I actually like it to be narrow where the sides of her mouth are still out of focus. I'm going to drag this point up from the bottom, holding down my Alt or Option key. There we go. You want to be careful. If you get these points too close to this outer edge, it can look a little hard-edged and not quite what we're going for. I'm going to pull down the top and bottom a little bit, and I'm just going to rotate it just a smidge. And I'm going to pull this up. I'm grabbing the blur. Give it a second. Let's pull this point straight down. I'm holding the Alt or Option key. There we go. And then select that blur point. And you can see I've got the blur set to 19. Let's move that back to 15 like it was before. And what you're doing is you're controlling the blur, remember, outside of your little oval area, outside of your iris or whatever this thing is, this circle. And then go ahead and hit OK to commit the changes. And you're going to see, give Photoshop a second, and it's going to drop your blur right in. And there we go. Eye is in focus, falling out of focus, fading wonderfully down to where the mouth or lips come back into focus, and all around that is just dropping out of focus continually. So that's the iris blur, the field blur, and the tilt shift blur. Three very cool new blurring features in Photoshop CS6. Grab the Photoshop CS6 Beta or Photoshop CS6 if the beta is no longer available, and take a few minutes and play with them. There's all kinds of neat things you can do with them, and they're a whole lot of fun to play with and use. So that's it for this one. Make sure you go check out the website. That's www.tutvid.com for more great free video tutorials. And also follow me on Twitter @tutvid. I'll catch you guys later.